Hi, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Just Crunch It. With us today, we have Javier Rincon, who I would call as the PMF guy. Javier has done a bunch of things in life, but what I think he really lives and breathes is PMF. And a testimony to that is the latest work that he's doing with PMF Builders, which tries to help as many startups get to the stage of PMF. Javier talks about atomic PMF, atomic MVP, and concepts that are very interesting personally to me. And I know for everyone here in the audience as well, who mostly keep listening to folks come and talk about data, it is going to be a welcome change. Well, not to undermine the kind of effort Javier has put in on other fronts, he's built companies, is a multiple time founder. He is a mentor at places like Techstars and the Founder Institute, amongst others. He acts as a product manager, advises people in product roles, helps with their PMF work to various startups. And that is just even the tip of the iceberg. We could talk all about what Javier does, but personally, I'm super excited to dive into what exactly is the concept of atomic PMF. We're going to just do that today. And Javier has been a very kind person in scheduling all of it. He was very accommodating. So I just want to get straight to it. Let's welcome Javier to the show. Hey, Javier, how are you doing today?
Hi, Vikram. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. Very excited to talk all things PMF with you today.
Yeah, you are very kind. So for all of our guests, we just had a minor glitch and we're going to do a re-record of part of the thing so that we can actually bring the correct messaging to you. And I think the question that I started with Javier, which was like, what exactly is atomic MVP and the concept of atomic PMF, and why are most people taking so much of time getting to it? Could you like just explain it for us the way you would to a 5-year-old?
Absolutely, Vikram. So, we are all as early stage founders trying to reach that magical thing called PMF, right? And it is a complicated thing. And there still is no set structure or way or too many guidelines on how to really arrive there. And we talked about there's a couple of critical elements within PMF. And one of them is, the way to get there, right? And this is something that can only be answered in the journey of releasing a product and then getting feedback from the market. But there's a second very critical question, which is the way we get there. And that's what Atomic MVP really tries to address, which is with the understanding that we're working on multiple assumptions and that there's a high risk that our ideas and our product is not going to get traction with the market. What we can really control is the amount of time that we employ in releasing an MVP in order to validate that with the market. And that's what really Atomic MVP tries to focus on, which is to release a very small slice of both product distribution and that focuses on a very specific demand that we can quickly release in the market and then get validation from.
So what I'm getting from you is that it's always about quick validation. And I think mostly as founders, where people go wrong is they hear some opinion of a customer or a potential prospect, and then they start adding more features in an attempt of impressing them. But at this stage, what would you advise someone? Would you say that, hey, step back and check on whether they are going to pay, step back and check whether there's some other signal? Like, how do you stop yourself from actually going down this route? Because at some point of time when you've identified PMF, of course, you build the product to be bigger and better and have more features. And how do you not prematurely go into that wrong direction? Like, what would you recommend people doing here?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of restraint, I think, involved in not taking it too far. And I think it's a constant exercise, right? When there's a few levels that we see in validation. These are the classic tests that are always shared with, which is, you go to do your customer interviews, you go to do your landing page, and you maybe go to do a non-functional prototype. And then there's the MVP, right? And it's very interesting that if you put those in a range of, on the x-axis, how many days it takes to build each of those tests, the customer interviews, the landing page, the non-functional prototype, they're all increase, in a very linear fashion. So one might take a day, another one might take, 2 days, and then 3 days for maybe non-functional prototype if you're doing a really good Figma. But all of a sudden we jump from 3-day tests to an MVP, right? And that there's an exponential gap there of growth in terms of time frame, which at the MVP, depending on who you work with, it could range from a month, it could range to 6 months or more, right? So we've all been in different projects. It depends on the tech, depends on many things. So I find that quite interesting, right? That there's a big delta there. There's a big difference of, okay, well, do these 3 tests that take you a week and then go into your 6-month build, right? There's something off there. There's something that we're clearly not doing well from a principal perspective. So I think the main aspect is to think, how can we reduce that time, and release something out into the market that is, linearly more time than what the previous experiment might be, right? So a lot of restraint needs to be done in terms of MVP building. And there is a very specific methodology, really, of once you have that firstly defined MVP that you think you might want to release, how you can cut it back drastically so that you can start releasing what I'm calling these atomic MVPs, which are these very thin slices. So there's two things that you mentioned that I think are interesting that we can go deeper into. And one is the element of validating the business side, so that there is in fact demand. And I think demand can be categorized in two things. Normally, this is called as is mentioned as desirability, but personally, I think demand is a much more accurate concept to define this because it does help set the frame of what we're trying to do. And I think demand is one that we're addressing an existing problem and with a gap in value. Right, and that would be your classic problem, or hair on fire problem. And then the other part is the actual readiness and willingness to pay for the solution, right? And I think those two things need to be differentiated. And many times, what we're trying to do is validate all of those things at the same time, right? We're doing a multivariate experiment, and those are very hard to get very definitive data on, specifically if we're having conversations with people, and it's not a behavioral test, right? We don't know what the answer is, which alludes to part of how the previous conversation started around there's confusion around why this is happening or why it's not happening. Better said. So I think those two aspects need to be or can be targeted independently. But I think there's a sequence of events that can help in validating these things, right? And I think it always starts with trying to understand the problem, right? Which is, even if we do have a solution, we want to, even before we do a demo, we need to validate that there is customer problem fit. So for example, even if I'm doing a non-functional prototype demo and I'm showing this to a potential user, the first thing that I need to do is validate that this is in fact a prototypical customer that I'm trying to address to, that has the intended problem that I'm trying to validate. Why? Because if he hates the prototype, but he doesn't have customer problem fit, then I'm not going to listen to the data that he's giving back to me, right? Because it would mess up the actual conclusions. I'm only going to listen to that person's information if in regards to the experiment. It could give other interesting data about adjacent markets, adjacent problems, and that's all great. But in regards to, is this a solution that is fitting to solve the problem of this specific customer, right? So I think that's very important to get this fit. And then once we have that, then we start presenting the solution, and we want to start getting numerical fit or numerical answers according to the usefulness of the solution, the utility of the solution, right? And then from then on, there's a big discussion here, and there's no clear-cut answer, in regards to when do you introduce pricing, right? Personally, I think it's always good to try to put the pricing barrier as fast as possible. At least once we know what the prototypical solution actually looks like. So if we come in and I think we have no validated assumptions about what a useful solution would be, and then we give the solution and the pricing test, again, we're doing a multivariate test, it's going to be confusing because if they say no, we don't know if it's because the price was too high or the solution was not good enough. So then we have to figure out, that, and I think that's not, the most effective way to do this. But if we start first with the solution, once we validated that there's customer problem fit, and we present the solution and they're excited in the solution, all right, then we start understanding that there are signals that this solution is or might fit the actual needs of this customer with that problem. All right, so once we have that guiding principle in effect, then I think we feel more secure in then putting the next real test, which is, yes, you've told me you're excited about my solution, and these are words, but now I want to test it with your behavior, right? And that's when we start putting the pricing test, right? And we can do that in multiple ways, whether it's in the design pilot, or we can have a pricing page if we're sending ads to that. And I think ultimately that is going to give us the final answer on whether the solution will in fact not only meet their needs, but that it's addressing a big enough problem, because the assumptions always waterfall back to the problem. Because if the solution fits and everything is good and the pricing is all right, everything's within budget, but they're not willing to actually go ahead with the pilot or with payment, then it must be, in most cases, that the problem is not big enough, or it doesn't have, or it's a problem within a job to be done that's not critical enough to the ultimate success of that individual.
Javier, but what changes if I am going against, let's say, an incumbent? And that is what I go through, right? Like, so not to force fit Crunch into the discussion, but we are into analytics. There are maybe 10 players who offer analytics. And of course, they have a very extended bunch of offerings packaged in the form of a product. And there are many of them. When you go into a room and you're trying to sell to a company that's established, and you have to sell to a company that's established because certain products are built for people who are, let's say, mature in terms of data, you of course get compared to all the basic thing that the other tool does. Does the definition of MVP change here? Like when I'm replacing a product, do I need to build everything that that product has done and then add a delta? Or do I just validate that delta first, get a paid commitment, and then build everything else? Because it's easy to say, it's very, very, very tough to do.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I think here, definitely not a clear-cut answer. A lot of discussion possibly here. And that's again when we separate the question one, which is what's the right answer here. And I think nobody can give an answer, a straight answer to that, because it depends a lot of times on the cases. But and then that leads us always to that second question, which is how fast can we iterate in order to validate if this direction is the correct one or it isn't. I think there's some guiding principles to the discussion. And I think we can set the basis for what the two different types of models are, which can set frameworks for the two different assumptions and the tests that we can launch in order to, validate that. I think the question here is, when we are attacking an incumbent player, right? So existing market, of course, I think the first question to be looked into is, can we effectively differentiate ourselves? Because ultimately, when there is a crowded market, if there is no differentiation in anything, and that might be whether it's on product, in distribution, or in the cost of delivery, then it's going to be nearly impossible to switch the consumer into our product, right? Because if there's a delta in differentiation in value, that's going to be exciting for them to come and try us. If there's a differentiation in distribution, it means that we're going to get a lot of leads, and that's going to enable us to invest money in other elements because we're going to be able to have more there. And if we have a differentiation execution, that's always going to translate into better pricing, for example. So we might be able to deliver the same value, but just cut the costs down drastically, right? So I think that we need to identify which is, the differentiation that we're going to go for. Very important.
Yeah.
Once I think we have that in place, and let's maybe focus on the more classic one, which is, I think, the value proposition differentiation. I think one of the very important things is to have a very clear understanding of what the other, existing products are offering, right? Because it is a strategic attack on a gap that we have identified, right? Something that they're not doing well, that we can very clearly define, that then we think we could do well, which is important enough for the consumer that it will switch him into our product. Of course, I think the never-ending question is, yes, we can identify that, let's say that feature, right, or that capability from the product, but then that also comes with the table stakes, right? All of the other features that the customer is expecting, to get from a product in order to switch, right? And I think there's two discussions inside, and one of them has been, I think, developing, in the last year or so. But I think that the first, discussion, which is the classic, no magical answer, is once we identify that feature, then start building on that, and then start filling it with the table stakes, right? So that's going to take, that's from a principal perspective, what needs to happen, right? One interesting approach to this strategy, which is really, again, just from a principles perspective, it's the only way to kind of approach it. One of the ways to get there, I've seen, in order to switch customers faster than not, is not to try to replace the tool or not to replace the competitor yet, which means that we can verticalize, right? Or we can focus on such a niche feature and add such tremendous value on that feature that even without all of the other features, the customer at a lower price can get into our product with their existing product and make use of that feature. And I've seen this develop in the last year, specifically around micro SaaS and micro companies, where they're not trying, in fact, to replace the tools that they're pretty much doing a better job at, right? They're just staying in their lane, right? But as an initial strategy, right? And what's happening around this is that the messaging is very strong around that specific feature, which I think drives the demand very strongly towards it. I think the all their capability, within product and engineering is geared towards developing, not, in this case, again, the atomic MVP is the release mechanism, but at this point, people quickly move into what they call the MLP, right? The minimum lovable product. We can just say that, into the minimal magical product, into a feature that delivers a really wow experience very quick, because you're not trying to do 15 features on 3 different platforms. So I think that this is a very interesting strategy to try out, because to differentiate yourself, you need definitely to wow somebody, right? You need to hit a mark. You need to deliver a solution on something that has not hit the mark before, right? And then when you do it in a micro feature and then you start asking money, your price is going to be lower, but you can start getting customers. And then as you get customers, then you start building on your product, and then you start adding price to your product. So it's a completely different approach, and I think it's being very successful. So I'm excited to see how it develops.
Yeah, no, it sounds very promising. But Javier, there's other side, right? Like the founder who's trying to get to PMF, or the company group of people who are trying to get to PMF, I often see them thinking that, they're not able to hit PMF because they've not been able to crack distribution. Or in other words, hey, I don't have 100,000 people in my audience. I'm not Elon Musk who can say, should I be launching $8 for Twitter paid plan and like 100 million people comment on it? So of course, what part of this struggle do you attribute to lack of having an audience? And I have a bunch of pointers like that because I want to bust some myths here or like establish them, which is, does it really matter if you have an audience or not? Like, is it a good excuse at all that, hey, I don't have an audience, which is why we are not able to get fast validation?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the most repeated questions of when I mentor startups at Techstars, for example, specifically when they're product oriented or engineering oriented, is a lot around distribution. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting. Again, when we talk about MVP, distribution is never really mentioned. And ultimately, the constraint when we are trying to validate something, the constraint is on the market, meaning that if we can't get prospects into our MVP, we don't get data. So that's the real constraint. And of course, building the MVP and taking a long time, that's also the other big one. But people arriving to our MVP is really where the first big bottleneck is. So that's something that I've started to write about and think about quite a bit. Which is what I'm calling like this minimum viable release, right? Which is something that needs to capture the slice. So it's the smallest slice or the thinnest slice that tries to capture all elements of the model, which is from demand to distribution to product. And the same way that we have that very famous little diagram of a pyramid of saying, don't release an MVP that's just functional. Try to have a little functionality, a little usability, a little bit. It's very similar. We can't do a release that just has an MVP because again, if we're not capturing a very tiny subset of users with a very niche problem, so that's part of the release, with one distribution channel, most likely at the start, and with an atomic MVP, then we don't loop fast enough around it. Right. So I think that's in principle something that we need to aim, this minimum viable releases. When we talk about by the way, this really allows us to measure the flow of our releases, in a very effective way. Meaning that adding to the question of, is not having an audience as an excuse, I think ultimately it doesn't matter what the problem is, right? I think as founders, the goal is for us to figure it out, right? And what it does help is that when we do pinpoint that, okay, well, we don't have an audience, then the next question is, all right, so there's a bottleneck there. It's a bottleneck that needs to be lifted. So
Yeah.
what are the different tests that we're going to deliver on or launch in order to see if we can lift that constraint, right? So if you have an
Yeah.
audience, there's no bottleneck because they arrive. So excellent, great if you have it. If not, we either need to build that audience or we need to
Yeah.
go on an outbound, throw some outbound experiments. So the options are limited there for us. But the say the options are there and we just need to launch experiments to validate which is the most effective one.
Okay. So the audience bit we have tackled, there's a bunch of other caveats. One of them is, hey, we've not been able to identify a niche, which is why we're not getting to PMF. The other thing that you hear very often is, oh, there's this product that exists, which I kind of classify as over researching. Like if I find a reason why I should not build the next big company in the world, I will always find something. Like if I go on and say why Elon Musk should not have built SpaceX, there would be like 100,000 reasons. And that is a tougher problem. If I go on and say why I should not build another BI tool, there are like, again, 100,000 reasons. So that is something else. So which is like, what part of not getting to PMF is attributed to not identifying a niche? What part of not getting to PMF is attributed to like over researching and getting an analysis paralysis? Or for that matter, what part of it you would, let's say, attribute to storytelling, which is like, hey, you were never able to actually convince people, right? Like closing the pitch, building relationships. It might be more relevant with someone going after an enterprise, maybe that you have to build relationships, but it's still relevant. So if I'm selling to enterprise, is it my ability to tell the story that's affecting whether I'm able to hit PMF or not? Could you share some opinions on them?
Yeah, I mean, I think pick your poison, right, of reasons not to hit that. I think all one and all of what you've mentioned are very clear possibilities of not hitting that, right? I think you mentioned over researching is certainly one. Niching or not niching down is another big one. If we just break those down, for a moment, I think in terms of niching down, I think more and more for myself and with other founders, and I think generally in the market, getting to the conclusion that it's really critical to just keep zooming in to who the customer is and to keep zooming in to what the subset of problems or subset problem we're trying to validate is. Because again, it always comes down to that in order to switch somebody, the value proposition, there's different measures, but some people say 5x, some people say 10x. It needs to be much better for somebody to invest and to believe and to switch. Because when we talk about users and we think about software, a software is just an automated control mechanism for them to arrive at their job to be done, right? So the controlling part requires effort on their side. That's why user interface is so important, and that's why it's a big differentiating factor in switching users. The other big one that we don't regularly think of, but it is a massive in jobs to be done, is all of the setup, all of the learning of the tool, all of the optimization of the tool, all of the fixing of the tool. So all of these adjacent jobs to be done are really important. So we're not really trying to switch a customer just to use our product. We're trying to switch a customer for the whole journey of what using our product will mean, right? And there's a lot of added effort. That's why they say that it needs to be so good. And specifically, we're all animals of habit. So once we're in a habit, a lot of the people might not be excited to switch. That's why the whole notion of going for early adopters is so important, because these are people that are drawn to new solutions, to testing. They're agile in their mind to change habits very fast, right? So I think niching down really allows us to deliver on a bigger quality solution, a bigger quality feature, right? And that allows us to then switch these people over. So I think that's absolutely critical. And I find it funny because I feel like when I'm niche down, I feel there's always more niche, to go down into, right? And and it's and then the other one is over researching, right? I identify completely with you, Vikram, when you're saying like, if we could find a solution, that's competitive and not to launch, we'd never do it. And I also have gone through that. And sometimes you find a competitor and then you just like grab your hands and despair, like, oh my God, like they're doing part of what we want to do. Like, are we just one more in the club, right? Like in a farm of roosters here, like, what am I doing here? Right. So I think that ultimately one of the models that's helped me align, and reconcile that internally, is that it is not a zero-sum game. That when we look at markets, there are, very extensive properties, and lands of markets that can be captured, right? And number one, just because there's an incumbent player, it doesn't mean that we can't enter. So that's, I think, number one. Number two is just because there's many, fragmented players, it doesn't mean that we can't enter also, because geographically there might be a lot of space for a new solution to come in place, because a competitor is just a company, and a company can only take so much market at such a speed rate, right? So that means that there's going to be something. Part of the issue is that maybe there's massive incumbents that have taken all the market and are so technologically and innovatively advanced that they don't allow space for a better product just because they're so good at what they do. Then I think there's a different conversation to be had, not to discourage anybody from trying to attack that problem. I think be welcome, right, and go for the stars there. But I think there's a differentiation there of who you're facing, right, in that element. So yeah. I think over researching, can certainly hurt. I think one of the things that I talked about also, and I'm going to post something on this very soon, which is the concept of, the build, measure, learn as a loop, right, which is very ingrained into all startups. I think it's lost part of its meaning. I think basically, as much as I love build, measure, learn, as much as I love lean startup, it's, been one of the initial parts of my journey inside launching products fast. I think it's ready for a bit of a version approach to it, because building implies very fast one of the drawbacks that we've talked, which is overbuilding. And overbuilding is such a common thing in every single team that I've been in, and that I have to stop myself from doing it, and I'm very focused on it, that I think the concept of these releases starts taking a better mindset around it. And I call this the model release approach, which is you model an idea, you model a way of growing, a model, a hypothesis of attacking the market with a value proposition, and then you have to test that with a release, right? And then you're not learning, you're validating. And validating is such a more specific word, because it implies that you're validating a very specific element around it. And what ultimately I think the driver of validation has to be a release. And a release means that no matter how much research you have, it doesn't matter how much research you have, unless you put something or anything in the hands of the customer, you're not going to validate that. And to close the loop on this topic, a release can be also a conversation, right? Because a demo of a product, a pitch of a product is a product just in verbal form. It's an offer. It's a verbal product. What I'm offering to you, it's the fastest product that I can get to you. It's a release. It's a pitch release, and we iterate on that release multiple times, right? And then a customer interview the same, a homepage the same, and ultimately a product also comes down in releases. But that means that we can't get stuck, in our over analysis, and we have to do a release of some kind to get some validation.
Yeah, but tell me one more thing, Javier. So how do you deal with product fatigue or exposure fatigue? And it's very apt today. Everyone is building an AI. They're adding an AI layer, and the minute you go into a room, specifically as someone who's like a first-time founder, they are the ones that struggle the most with the PMF aspect, because there are illusions as to what is progress.
Yeah.
There is already a judgment that is made the minute someone hears that one-liner about what you do. And that judgment is for all the right and wrong reasons. Like I have gone through 100 products that do smart email composition. So if a new founder comes and says, "Oh, our product helps you write the best email," I'm like, "Oh yeah, oh I know what you're going to pitch," right? Like so. How, what do you recommend people to do with this? Because like this is real. It stresses a lot of people out, and no one asks these questions. But I think like when you're thinking about PMF, it's very easy for a founder to get into the loop of, you know what, like we're trying to go after the world. The product is still valid. It's just that people are exposed to the wrong products. We need to teach them. And you keep seeing these words like, oh, we need to enable learning and we need to like drive the momentum. And that is maybe just a lie you're telling to yourself. Maybe you're not getting the PMF. So what do you recommend to these people?
Great question again, Vikram. Also, not clear cut, right? I think here it's always about trying to catch what the signals for what answer might be the most logical. Uh, I would normally tend towards that you're not fooling yourself. And I think that's normally just because the most, the highest likelihood, honestly, right? And when we're building product, is that we're not hitting the mark. So I think that's, the first basis. Of course, there's always exceptions to that. And we've seen those exceptions, which is everybody was saying no, no, no. And all of a sudden something hit. I do think there are exceptions. I do think there's things that we don't know about those stories. They're told in a very surface level, and they give us the impression that there was always, blockages, and there was no, 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 and then yes. I don't believe that's accurate. I think there's always micro signals that allow us to understand, along the way. So fatigue is a real, real thing, right? And we can see it, right? When we're trying to contact people, if we're trying to message them on LinkedIn or emailing them, and we're trying to deliver one pitch and trying to gain interest into a call or something like that, people are just getting bombarded. And that is a real issue. And more than not, we feel that, there's others that don't have the right product and they're messing things for us, right? Which is really frustrating. I mean, I've going through that also. I think really ultimately it comes down to what are we going to do about it? And I think it comes down to what are the potential elements of differentiation. As with the product, we need differentiation in how we are distributing and arriving to our clients, right, and catching their attention. So we see all sorts of different exciting things, right? From different types of messages to creating a document or creating some kind of value and sending it to the client, to doing podcasts, right, with each other, right? There's different innovative and different ways that we can try to gain the attention. Ultimately, as always, I do feel it goes down to how well, once you have the attention, how well can I resolve this problem for you and how better I can do it for than others. And I think it really ultimately comes down to that, right? The promise. That if the promise is strong enough, and then that you've contacted enough people to warrant that you're hitting an early adopter, right? Somebody that's forward, that does have the problem, that's tried some potential solution, has the budget for it, then we're maximizing the chance for them to say, wow, yeah, I am going to give it a go. And then,
So you're listing all of these points, and I get it. We've talked about loops, we've talked about minimum viable, so many things, minimum viable X, minimum viable Y. Would you say overall all of it can be templatized? Is that even the right way of looking at it? Because there are, of course, contextual, like a lot of questions that I asked had answers like, oh yeah, no one can go answering this concretely. There's a debate around it. But do you think this can be templatized?
I think that what can be templatized is that second question. Again, right? We have two questions. One is what's the way forward? And then question two is how fast can we validate the way forward? I think question one can certainly not be templatized because we have seen, in some cases, but in most cases not, founders that do try to repeat the same play and it just doesn't work, right? In some specific cases it has because they were so far ahead that they just repeated it and it happened. But I think what can be templatized is question two, which is how fast and how efficiently can we try to find an answer to that? And that's in effect the scientific method. And that's what we're trying to do with this approach to finding PMF, which is there is a set way of methods that we can try to define customer problems. There's a set way that we can gain initial signals to understand if those problems are important enough that they want a solution. There's a certain way that we can try to validate if the solution is interesting enough for them. And there's a certain way, for us to launch, small, products or these atomic MVPs to try to gain behavioral data that supports that users will be using that product. So I think that's the most important to kind of close the loop there is that what we can templatize is the way that we can try to find a solution to arrive there. There's a way we can define the problem, gain signals on the problem, and then build atomic MVPs that will in fact validate that there is behavioral data that supports the hypothesis that will switch users. And I think that's the approach to it. We can't templatize the answer, but we can certainly templatize the way to arrive to the answer.
Yeah, this is all very exciting. Javier, so is this what your workshops are about? Like, what do you teach? Could you tell us about what your workshops are? What are you teaching people?
Absolutely. PMF Builders, which is a sort of community that I'm working on, is just focused around my passion around PMF and understanding PMF and trying to crack PMF. As trying to develop these operational kind of framework to PMF. And um, right now, what I'm doing is I'm delivering some, really, I think, valuable short workshops, that are maybe like an hour and a half, and they have a very entry level price point, so that a lot of people can try to access them. So I think a lot of this information that I'm delivering, there's workshops that are going on the, almost at 1K kind of level, and I think they're amazing workshops, and they're very, very valuable. But what I'm trying to do is really try to work in tandem with existing startups down in the trenches and help them get to the PMF, right? So these workshops are just a way for me to start the conversation and open the conversation with them so that we can get to a level of working together. And yeah, it's something that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, it definitely sounds very intriguing and exciting. Javier, I just want to ask you one last final question, which I've always asked people. As you look back on all the work, and it doesn't have to be related about PMF, but if it is, that's also brilliant. Uh, what are the three learnings you would leave everyone with? Like as a closing note, what are the three things you would love to share with everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, powerful question. So I think that my passion really always kind of takes me back to these concepts of lean, which is try to identify where the waste is, because that's ultimately what drives the whole enterprise to not non good a successful destination. We just run out of time, or we run out of motivation, right? So I think that trying to identify the waste, what doesn't add value, is super important. I think the second one probably, so very simple, not surprising things, but I think that's why they're important. Number two would be clarity. I think that there is ultimately a lot of confusion around the topic in general, and that's normal because it is something difficult. And there's also a lot of confusion in between people, right? So I think getting clarity, ultimately individually around what we're trying to do, I think it's hyper important. And then communicating that well and getting alignment around those things, it's incredibly important, because if we're not aligned on some of these things, and I think it regularly, most, and you probably included, might attest that those are the origins of problems within teams, that we're not fully aligned on a few things, and we don't have to be on everything, but there is a few things that we need to be aligned on, right? If we're trying to go towards a vision, launch a product, target the customer, if we have misalignment within what we're trying to do, that's definitely going to cause problems and going to cause weight. And most likely than not, what I found is that there's unclarity about how we think about things, and that unclarity is represented as misalignment, which causes a lot of tension, and it causes. So clarity, I think, is an incredible resource that we can go for. And then lastly, the other word that comes to me that is an intricate concept of lean, and that I'm very passionate about. It's super old school. It's the word quality, and I think it's lost its meaning, it's lost its value. But when you take quality, the word quality, towards a lean environment, the 70s, and the 80s, it is the most respected word in those environments, because lean really originated, and well, more than originated, it took a foothold and got its wings, in the automotive industry. And in the automotive industry, we're
Yeah.
talking about a problem in quality that's represented in the one of a millionth. It can certainly have a lot of problems, because there's safety problems, right? And that's going to translate into massive costs. So the word quality, I think, is incredibly important. I think the word quality, to finalize the summary there, and how that's or misrepresented, is that we overdo something, right? And then we think that's quality. No, the way I think that quality is represented is lean is customer value, which is define what the customer value is and build and provide it to meet that customer value. And anything that is executed on that does not meet the customer value or the quality translates into waste. And that's the loop that we're trying to always work around, which is to provide quality, identify wasteful activities that don't provide quality, and then continue in that loop. So those are the three things that are very personal that I always keep coming back to, honestly, in all aspects of my life, not just product, but in everything that I do.
Love the last one, the old school one, quality. Like a very golden thought. Where all good things come to an end. And I'm again incredibly thankful that in spite of the glitch, we were able to extend this by whatever number of minutes, and you were very, very, very kind and very patient. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you. I'm sure to anyone who's listening about PMF, and to myself as well, a lot of the pointers you raised would like be very good as anchoring points. Uh, I think like we need to probably put these points on a wall and then just keep looking at them every day, because it's really easy to get lost when you're going through like day-to-day challenges. But it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Vikram, to you for having me and for fostering the conversation about such an important topic. I'm always excited to keep posting content and to keep engaging in discussion. This is an iterative process also of, a hard problem that we're trying to crack all together. So it's exciting, to talk to you and see that you're so passionate about it. And all, very excited about Crunch. And I think you guys are progressing in a great way. And I'm sure that you're going to crack that egg soon.